My name is Sloane and I'm 28 years old. 2 months ago, I discovered that my entire family had been lying to me for over a decade about something that would change everything I thought I knew about loyalty, blood, and the people I trusted most. What started as being uninvited to my sister's wedding because I'd supposedly make things awkward turned into uncovering a web of deception so deep that it destroyed relationships, exposed years of manipulation, and ultimately led to the most satisfying moment of justice I've ever witnessed. The family that betrayed me learned the hard way that some secrets have consequences. Before we dive into this wild ride of family drama and sweet revenge, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below and don't forget to hit that like button if you're ready for a story that'll have you questioning everything you think you know about family loyalty. Make sure to subscribe, because trust me, you won't want to miss how this unfolds, and the ending will absolutely blow your mind. The phone call came on a Tuesday evening in March, just as I was settling down with takeout after a long day at my marketing job in downtown Seattle. Mom's voice had that carefully controlled tone she used when she was about to deliver news she knew would hurt. "Sloane, honey, we need to talk about Cassidy's wedding," she began, and I could already feel my stomach dropping. My younger sister Cassidy had been planning her dream wedding for 18 months, and I'd been nothing but supportive throughout the entire process. I'd helped her choose the venue, spent weekends, dress shopping, and even offered to help with the floral arrangements since I'd developed quite the green thumb over the years. "What about it?" I asked, though something in her tone told me I wasn't going to like the answer. "Well, David's family is traditional, very traditional, and they've expressed some concerns about having you there." She paused, and I could hear her take a deep breath. "They think your presence might make things awkward for their son." The words hit me like a physical blow. David was Cassidy's fiancé, a guy from what Mom always described as good stock, meaning wealthy, conservative, and the kind of family that still believed in outdated social hierarchies. "But what could possibly be awkward about me attending my own sister's wedding? I don't understand," I said, setting down my chopsticks. "What exactly would be awkward about me being there?" Another pause. "Sloane, you know how they are about your lifestyle choices, your career, your independence, the fact that you're not married yet. They think it sends the wrong message to their extended family." I felt my blood pressure rising. "My lifestyle choices. Mom, I'm a successful marketing executive. I own my own condo. I volunteer at the animal shelter on weekends. What exactly is wrong with my lifestyle?" "It's not wrong, honey. It's just different from what they expect. And Cassidy really wants this wedding to go smoothly. She's asked me to talk to you about, maybe, sitting this one out." The betrayal cut deep. This wasn't just about David's family, this was about my own sister choosing her new in-laws' comfort over having her only sibling at her wedding. We'd been close growing up, or so I thought. Cassidy was 3 years younger, and I'd always been protective of her. I was the one who helped her with homework, who taught her how to drive when Dad was too busy with work, who listened to her cry over her first heartbreak. "She actually asked you to uninvite me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "She didn't want to hurt your feelings by asking directly. She thought it would be easier coming from me." Easier. As if there was an easy way to tell someone they weren't wanted at one of the most important days in their family's life. I sat there in my living room looking at the framed photos on my mantel, pictures of Cassidy and me at family vacations, graduation ceremonies, birthday parties. Had I been deluding myself about how close we actually were? "What did Dad say about this?" I asked. "Your father thinks it's for the best too. We all just want what's best for Cassidy." And there it was. My entire family had discussed this behind my back and decided unanimously that I was the problem. Not David's judgmental family, not their archaic views about women, me. I was the embarrassment they needed to hide away. I see, I said, though I didn't see it all. And if I refuse to sit this out, Sloane, please don't make this harder than it has to be. The invitations have already gone out. Your name isn't on them. They'd already decided. This conversation wasn't about asking for my cooperation, it was about informing me of a decision that had already been made. I'd been erased from my sister's wedding like an inconvenient detail. Fine, I said, my voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill over. I hope she has a wonderful day. Thank you for understanding, honey. This doesn't change how much we love you. But it did change things. It changed everything. As I hung up the phone, I realized that this wasn't just about a wedding. This was about my family's willingness to sacrifice me, to maintain appearances, to keep peace with people who didn't even know me, but had judged me worthy of exclusion. Over the next few weeks, I watched from the sidelines as my family's social media filled with wedding preparations. Cassidy posted pictures of her final dress fitting. Mom shared photos of centerpiece arrangements, and Dad posted about his two beautiful daughters, though apparently only one was beautiful enough to include in the actual celebration. The wedding day came and went. I spent it hiking alone in the mountains, trying to process the reality that my family had chosen strangers' comfort over my inclusion. When I got home that evening, I found exactly one text from Cassidy: "Wish you could have been here. Love you. Wish I could have been there." As if it had been some unavoidable circumstance rather than a deliberate choice to exclude me. The weeks following the wedding were some of the loneliest of my life. My family group chat, once filled with daily updates and inside jokes, had gone eerily quiet. When someone did post, it felt forced and artificial, like they were all walking on eggshells around the elephant in the room. It was during one of these quiet evenings that I decided to do something I'd never done before. I started really looking into David's family. If they had such strong opinions about me that they could convince my family to uninvite me from the wedding, I wanted to understand exactly what kind of people held that much influence over my loved ones. What I found initially seemed to support everything I'd been told. The Morrison family, David's family, were indeed wealthy and traditional. David's father, Richard Morrison, was a prominent real estate developer who'd built half the luxury neighborhoods in our city. His mother, Patricia, was involved in numerous charity organizations and served on the boards of several cultural institutions. They were the kind of family that appeared in the society pages of the local newspaper, always impeccably dressed and maintaining the perfect image. But as I dug deeper, using my marketing research skills to scour public records, social media, and news archives, I started to notice some inconsistencies. For a family so concerned with traditional values and moral righteousness, they seemed to have a suspicious number of business dealings that skirted ethical boundaries. Richard Morrison's development company had been involved in several controversies over the years. Accusations of cutting corners on safety regulations, pushing out low-income residents to make way for luxury developments, and what appeared to be some very convenient city council votes that always seemed to favor his projects. Nothing that had resulted in criminal charges, but definitely a pattern that suggested the Morrison family's moral high ground wasn't quite as solid as they pretended. Then I found something interesting in an old newspaper archive. A small article from 15 years ago about a charity scandal. Patricia Morrison had been the treasurer of a children's charity that had mysteriously lost a significant amount of funding. The article was brief and buried in the back pages, but it mentioned that the missing funds had never been recovered and that Mrs. Morrison had resigned from her position to focus on family commitments. This was curious, but not necessarily damning. What really caught my attention was a detail in the article that mentioned other board members. One name stood out, Elizabeth Chen Martinez, who had been the charity's secretary at the time, and had also resigned following the scandal. I recognized that name. Elizabeth Chen Martinez was my mom's best friend from college, someone she'd lost touch with years ago. I remembered Mom mentioning her occasionally, always with a note of sadness about how they'd grown apart after some unspecified misunderstanding. Could this be connected? It seemed like a stretch, but my investigative instincts were telling me there was more to this story. I decided to try to track down Elizabeth and see if she remembered anything about the charity incident that might shed light on the Morrison family's true character. Finding Elizabeth wasn't difficult in the age of social media. She was now living in Portland, working as a social worker, and apparently leading a quiet, modest life that was the complete opposite of the Morrison family's ostentatious lifestyle. I debated for days about whether to reach out to her, but eventually decided I had nothing to lose. I sent her a carefully worded message explaining who I was and asking if she'd be willing to chat about her time working with Patricia Morrison on the charity board. I tried to keep it casual, mentioning that I was doing some background research for a project and had come across her name in connection with the organization. To my surprise, she responded within hours, and her reply was immediate and emotional. If this is about Patricia Morrison and what happened with Children's Hope Foundation, I've been waiting 15 years for someone to ask the right questions. We arranged to meet the following weekend at a coffee shop in Portland. I told my family I was taking a day trip to visit some college friends, which wasn't entirely a lie. I was investigating something that could potentially affect all of our futures. Elizabeth was a petite woman in her early 50s with graying hair and kind eyes that held a wariness I recognized from my own recent experiences with family betrayal. She'd agreed to meet me because, as she explained, she'd never gotten closure on what had happened all those years ago. Patricia Morrison destroyed my reputation and my friendship with your mother, she told me over coffee, her hands wrapped tightly around her mug. And she did it to cover up her own crimes. The story Elizabeth told me was shocking in its callousness. Patricia Morrison hadn't just embezzled money from the children's charity, she'd systematically stolen over $200,000 over the course of 2 years, using her position as treasurer to redirect funds meant for underprivileged children into accounts controlled by her family's shell companies. When Elizabeth had started asking questions about discrepancies in the books, Patricia had gone on the offensive. She'd accused Elizabeth of being the one stealing money, had planted evidence to support her claims, and had launched a whisper campaign that destroyed Elizabeth's reputation in their social circle. Your mother believed her, Elizabeth said, tears gathering in her eyes. Patricia convinced everyone that I was the thief, that I was unstable and jealous of her family's success. She was so convincing that even Maria, your mother, turned against me. I lost everything. My social connections, my volunteer positions, even friendships I'd had since college. But Elizabeth had kept evidence. She'd made copies of financial documents before Patricia could destroy them, had saved emails and records that proved Patricia's guilt. She'd taken everything to the police, but by then Patricia had covered her tracks too well. Without access to the charity's main accounts, and with Patricia's word against hers, the authorities couldn't build a strong enough case to prosecute. I've kept all of it, Elizabeth told me, pulling out a thick folder. I always hoped that someday someone would come forward who could help me prove the truth. As I looked through the documents, my hands shaking slightly, I realized I wasn't just looking at evidence of a 15-year-old crime. I was looking at the reason my family had so readily accepted the Morrison family's judgment about my character. Patricia Morrison had spent years cultivating an image of moral superiority, and my family had bought into it completely. But there was something else, something Elizabeth hadn't mentioned yet that I could sense she was holding back. There's more, isn't there? I asked. She nodded slowly. The worst part is how Patricia used her connections to continue hurting people who threatened her image. She's done this before, Sloane. She's used her family's social influence to exclude and punish anyone who might expose their true nature. And now, apparently, she's done it to you. As Elizabeth and I sat in that Portland coffee shop, she revealed something that made my blood run cold. Patricia Morrison's pattern of destroying people who threatened her family's image hadn't ended with the charity scandal. Over the years, she'd systematically used her social influence to exclude, discredit, and punish anyone who might expose the Morrison family's true nature. She keeps files, Elizabeth told me, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. Detailed information about anyone she perceives as a threat, their personal lives, their vulnerabilities, their family connections. She uses it like ammunition. I felt my stomach drop. What kind of files? The kind that would make you question everything you think you know about privacy and manipulation. Elizabeth reached into her purse and pulled out a small flash drive. After the charity incident, I couldn't let it go. I spent years quietly investigating her, building my own case. I documented every family she'd destroyed, every person she'd driven out of social circles, every life she'd ruined to protect her perfect image. She plugged the drive into her laptop and showed me folders containing hundreds of documents. Names, photos, detailed profiles of people Patricia had targeted over the years. There were families who'd been excluded from country clubs, business owners who'd suddenly lost important contracts, even teenagers who'd been mysteriously rejected from prestigious colleges despite having perfect qualifications. She targets anyone who doesn't fit her narrow definition of acceptable, Elizabeth explained. Single women who are too successful, families with unconventional structures, people who ask too many questions about her family's business dealings. Sound familiar? It did sound familiar. Terrifyingly familiar. I was looking at a pattern of systematic social destruction that had been going on for over a decade, and I was just the latest victim. But how does she get away with it? I asked, scrolling through file after file of ruined lives. Because she's smart about it. She never does the dirty work herself. She finds ways to make other people do it for her, usually by convincing them it's for their own good or for the good of someone they love. Elizabeth's expression grew grim. She convinced your mother that excluding you was protecting Cassidy's marriage. She made your family believe they were being loving and supportive by sacrificing you. The manipulation was breathtaking in its scope and cruelty. Patricia Morrison had turned my own family against me by convincing them that my exclusion was an act of love for my sister. She'd made them complicit in their own betrayal of me. There's something else, Elizabeth said, her fingers hesitating over the keyboard. Something specific about your situation that makes it worse than just general social manipulation. She opened another folder, this one labeled with my family's name. My heart stopped as I saw documents detailing our family's financial situation, our personal relationships, even photos of our house and cars. Patricia Morrison had been investigating my family for months, probably since Cassidy and David had first started dating seriously. She always does background checks on potential in-laws, Elizabeth explained. But in your case, she found something she thought she could use. The file contained copies of documents I recognized, my college transcripts, my employment records, even medical records that should have been private. But tucked among them was something that made me feel sick to my stomach, a psychological evaluation from my freshman year of college. During my first semester, I'd struggled with anxiety and depression related to the pressure of academic performance and being away from home for the first time. Like many college students, I'd sought counseling through the university's mental health services. The evaluation, which was supposed to be completely confidential, had diagnosed me with adjustment disorder and recommended ongoing therapy. I'd worked through those issues and had been mentally healthy for years, but seeing those private documents in Patricia Morrison's files felt like a violation of the deepest kind. She used this against you, Elizabeth said gently. She convinced your family that you were unstable, that having you at the wedding would be risky, that you might cause a scene or embarrass the family. She made them believe they were protecting everyone by excluding you. The pieces were falling into place, and the picture they formed was devastating. My family hadn't just chosen to exclude me based on the Morrison family's snobbish preferences. They'd been convinced that I was genuinely dangerous, unstable, a threat to my sister's happiness. Patricia Morrison had weaponized my private medical history to turn my own family against me. How did she get access to my medical records? I asked, though I was afraid of the answer. She has connections everywhere. Hospital administrators, insurance company employees, university staff. She's been building this network for years, and she's very generous with donations to organizations that employ people who have access to the information she wants. The scope of the violation was staggering. Not only had Patricia Morrison destroyed my relationship with my family, but she'd done it by illegally accessing my private medical information and using it to paint me as mentally unstable. But Elizabeth wasn't finished. There's one more thing you need to know about the Morrison family, something that makes all of this even worse. She opened one final folder, and what I saw there made me gasp audibly. Financial records showing massive debts, legal documents indicating multiple lawsuits, and most shocking of all, evidence that the Morrison family was facing bankruptcy. Their perfect image was built on a foundation of debt and legal troubles that they'd been desperately trying to hide. David's family isn't just morally corrupt, Elizabeth said. They're financially ruined. The wedding, the lifestyle, the social climbing, it's all a facade to hide the fact that they're drowning in debt and legal problems. Richard Morrison's development company is under federal investigation for fraud, and Patricia's charity work is being audited by the IRS. The irony was bitter. My family had sacrificed me to gain approval from a family that was not only morally bankrupt but literally bankrupt as well. They'd chosen the approval of criminals and con artists over their own daughter and sister. As I sat there processing this information, I felt something I hadn't felt since the wedding invitation conversation: power. For the first time in months, I wasn't the victim of this story. I was the person with the truth, the evidence, and the ability to expose everything. "What do you want to do with this information?" Elizabeth asked, as if she could read my thoughts. I looked at her, this woman who'd been carrying the truth about Patricia Morrison's crimes for 15 years, waiting for someone who could help her seek justice. I thought about all the families in those files, all the lives that had been destroyed by one woman's need to maintain a perfect image built on lies. And I thought about my own family, who were about to learn some very uncomfortable truths about the people they'd chosen over their own daughter. Now, I know some of you are probably on the edge of your seats, wondering what I decided to do with this explosive information. Should I have confronted my family immediately, gone straight to the authorities, or was there a more strategic way to handle this that would ensure justice was truly served? Let me know in the comments what you think you would have done in my situation, and make sure you're subscribed, because the next part of this story involves some serious detective work and a plan that would make even the most experienced revenge plotters proud. The drive back to Seattle felt like the longest 3 hours of my life. My mind was racing with the implications of everything Elizabeth had shown me, and I knew I was at a crossroads. I could either let this information consume me with anger and resentment, or I could use it strategically to seek justice, not just for myself, but for all the people Patricia Morrison had destroyed over the years. By the time I reached my apartment, I'd made my decision. I was going to build an airtight case against Patricia Morrison that would expose her crimes and manipulation to everyone, including my family. But I was going to do it the right way, methodically and carefully, so that when the truth finally came out, there would be no way for her to wiggle out of accountability. The first step was organizing all the evidence Elizabeth had given me. I spent the entire weekend creating a detailed timeline of Patricia's criminal activities, cross-referencing dates, names, and financial records. The pattern was even clearer when laid out chronologically. Every few years, Patricia would identify a new target, systematically destroy their reputation, and then use their downfall to strengthen her own position in social circles. I also started my own investigation into the Morrison family's current legal troubles. Using my marketing background and research skills, I accessed public court records, business filings, and news archives. What I found was worse than Elizabeth had indicated. Richard Morrison's development company was indeed under federal investigation, but not just for fraud. The FBI was looking into connections between his business and several organized crime figures who had invested in his projects. There were allegations of money laundering, bribery of city officials, and environmental violations that had resulted in contaminated water supplies in several low-income neighborhoods. Patricia's charity work was also under scrutiny. The IRS audit had uncovered evidence that she'd been using multiple charitable organizations as fronts for tax evasion schemes. She would establish fake charities, funnel money through them to avoid taxes, and then dissolve the organizations before anyone could trace the funds. But the most shocking discovery was about David himself. While researching his background, I found sealed court records from his college years indicating that he'd been accused of sexual assault by 2 different women. The charges had been dropped both times, but the pattern suggested that the Morrison family had used their wealth and influence to make the accusations disappear. This wasn't just about social manipulation anymore. I was looking at a family with a decades-long history of serious crimes, and somehow they'd convinced my family that I was the problem person who needed to be excluded from important events. Armed with this information, I decided it was time to start gathering additional evidence and building relationships with other people who'd been victimized by the Morrison family. Elizabeth had given me contact information for several other families who'd been targeted over the years, and I began reaching out to them carefully. The stories I heard were heartbreaking and infuriating. There was the Martinez family whose teenage daughter had been mysteriously rejected from Stanford despite having perfect SAT scores and a flawless GPA, only to discover later that Patricia Morrison had spread rumors about the girl's mental health to admissions counselors. There was the Johnson family who'd been forced to leave their country club after Patricia accused the father of inappropriate behavior with no evidence whatsoever. Each family had been isolated and made to feel like they were the only ones experiencing Patricia's wrath. They'd suffered in silence, assuming that speaking out would only make things worse. But when they realized they weren't alone, that there was a pattern of abuse spanning decades, they were eager to help build a case against her. I also decided to do something that felt risky but necessary. I started documenting my own family's involvement in my exclusion. I began recording phone conversations with my parents and sister, always legally and with the proper notifications required by state law. What I captured was disturbing. In one conversation with my mother, I asked her directly about the medical records and why she believed I might be unstable enough to cause problems at the wedding. Her response revealed just how thoroughly Patricia had manipulated her. Patricia showed me documentation that proved you've had ongoing mental health issues since college. Mom said, her voice filled with what sounded like genuine concern. She was worried that the stress of the wedding might trigger an episode. She said she'd seen it happen before with unstable family members at important events. The manipulation was so complete that my own mother genuinely believed she was protecting me by excluding me. Patricia had convinced her that keeping me away from the wedding was an act of love, not rejection. What kind of documentation, I asked, already knowing the answer but needing to hear it confirmed. Medical records, therapy notes, things like that. Patricia has connections in the healthcare industry, and she was able to verify that you'd been diagnosed with serious psychological issues. She said it would be irresponsible to put you in a high-stress situation like a wedding. There it was. Confirmation that Patricia had illegally accessed my private medical records and used them to convince my family that I was mentally unstable. This wasn't just social manipulation, it was a federal crime involving the violation of HIPAA privacy laws. I had similar conversations with my father and sister, each revealing the extent to which Patricia had poisoned their perception of me. Dad believed I was financially irresponsible and might embarrass the family by asking for money or acting inappropriately around wealthy guests. Cassidy had been convinced that I was jealous of her engagement and might try to sabotage her wedding day. Every conversation made it clearer that my family hadn't chosen to exclude me out of malice or lack of love. They'd been systematically manipulated by a master manipulator who had convinced them that their betrayal of me was actually an act of protection and love. While gathering this evidence, I also started working with Elizabeth to prepare a comprehensive report for law enforcement. We compiled financial records proving Patricia's embezzlement from multiple charities, documentation of her illegal access to private medical records, and testimonies from dozens of families who'd been victimized by her social manipulation campaigns. But I wanted to do more than just see Patricia Morrison face legal consequences. I wanted my family to understand exactly how they'd been manipulated, and I wanted them to face the reality of what their willingness to believe the worst about me had cost our relationships. So, I developed a plan that would expose the truth in the most impactful way possible. I was going to gather everyone together, my family, the Morrison family, and several of Patricia's other victims, and present the evidence publicly, forcing everyone to confront the reality of who they'd chosen to trust over their own flesh and blood. The plan was risky. It could backfire spectacularly and leave me even more isolated from my family than I already was. But I was tired of being the victim in this story, and I was ready to take back control of the narrative. I spent weeks planning every detail of what I was starting to think of as the reckoning. I booked a private room at an upscale restaurant where I knew my family would feel comfortable, and I invited everyone under the guise of wanting to clear the air about the wedding situation and move forward as a family. What they didn't know was that they were about to learn some very uncomfortable truths about the people they'd chosen to trust over me, and about the lengths to which Patricia Morrison had gone to destroy anyone she perceived as a threat to her family's carefully constructed image. The private dining room at Meridian Restaurant was elegantly appointed with dark wood paneling and soft lighting that should have created an atmosphere of warmth and reconciliation. Instead, as I watched my family and the Morrison family settle into their seats around the large mahogany table, the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. I had spent days choreographing this moment, and now that it was here, I felt surprisingly calm. In my briefcase beside my chair, I had copies of every document Elizabeth had given me, along with additional evidence I'd gathered over the past month. More importantly, I had Elizabeth herself sitting quietly in the adjacent room, ready to join us when I gave her the signal. "Thank you all for coming," I began, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I was about to reveal. "I know this has been a difficult time for our family, and I appreciate everyone's willingness to come together to work through our differences." My father nodded approvingly while my mother reached across the table to squeeze my hand. "We're so glad you reached out, honey," she said. "We've all been hoping we could find a way to move past this wedding situation." Cassidy looked uncomfortable but relieved. "I felt terrible about how everything happened," she admitted. I just want us to be a family again. Patricia Morrison sat at the far end of the table, perfectly composed in a cream-colored designer suit, her silver hair styled immaculately. She smiled at me with what appeared to be genuine warmth, but I could see the calculation behind her eyes. She was probably already planning how to manage whatever emotional outburst she expected from me. "I'm so pleased you've chosen to approach this situation with maturity," Sloane Patricia said, her voice carrying that practiced tone of benevolent authority. "I know this hasn't been easy for you, but sometimes we have to make difficult decisions for the good of the family unit." David nodded in agreement while Richard Morrison looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. I got the impression that he wasn't entirely comfortable with his wife's social machinations, but he'd learned over the years not to question her methods. "You're absolutely right, Patricia," I replied, pulling out my briefcase. "Sometimes difficult decisions do have to be made for the good of the family. And sometimes the truth has to come out no matter how uncomfortable it might be." I set a thick folder on the table in front of me, and I noticed Patricia's eyes narrow slightly as she focused on it. Some instinct was telling her that this wasn't going to be the emotional reconciliation she'd expected. "Before we talk about moving forward, I think it's important that we're all working with the same information," I continued. "Over the past month, I've learned some things about the circumstances surrounding my exclusion from the wedding that I think everyone needs to know." My mother looked puzzled. "What kind of things, sweetheart?" "Well, for starters, I've learned that the decision to exclude me wasn't based on David's family having general concerns about my lifestyle or career choices." I opened the folder and pulled out the first set of documents. "It was based on specific, detailed personal information about me that someone had illegally obtained and shared with this family." I placed copies of my medical records on the table, and I watched my family's faces as they recognized the documents. These were private, confidential files from my college counseling sessions, documents that should never have been accessible to anyone outside of my healthcare providers. "These are my private medical records from over 7 years ago," I said, my voice carrying an edge of steel. "Records that someone obtained illegally and used to convince my family that I was mentally unstable and dangerous." Patricia's composure finally cracked slightly. "I'm not sure what you're implying, Sloane, but I'm not implying anything," I cut her off. "I'm stating facts. These records were illegally accessed and used to manipulate my family into believing that excluding me from the wedding was necessary for everyone's safety." My father was staring at the documents with growing horror. "How did these get out? Who had access to these?" "Someone with connections in the healthcare industry," I replied, looking directly at Patricia. "Someone who's been systematically collecting private information about people she perceives as threats to her family's image." I pulled out more documents, Elizabeth's files, showing Patricia's pattern of targeting and destroying other families over the years. As I laid out photo after photo, document after document, showing the systematic destruction of innocent people's lives, the room grew increasingly silent. "This is what you chose over your own daughter," I said to my parents, my voice breaking slightly despite my efforts to stay controlled. "A woman who has spent decades destroying families, stealing money from children's charities, and using illegal means to access private information about anyone who might threaten her carefully constructed image." Cassidy was staring at the documents in shock. "I don't understand." "Patricia, what is all this?" But Patricia Morrison was no longer the composed society matron she'd been moments before. Her face was flushed with anger and her hands were trembling as she reached for the documents. "This is a fabrication," she said, her voice rising. "I don't know what kind of vendetta you think you're pursuing here, but these accusations are completely false." "Are they?" I asked, and I signaled toward the adjacent room. "Because I have someone here who's been waiting 15 years to tell her side of the story." Elizabeth Chen Martinez walked into the room and I watched Patricia's face go completely white. For the first time since I'd known her, Patricia Morrison looked genuinely afraid. "Hello, Patricia," Elizabeth said calmly, taking a seat at the table. "I think it's time we told everyone the truth about what really happened with the Children's Hope Foundation." What followed was 90 minutes of the most devastating testimony I'd ever witnessed. Elizabeth methodically presented evidence of Patricia's embezzlement, her pattern of destroying innocent people's reputations, and her systematic use of illegal information gathering to target anyone who threatened her. Family's image. My family sat in stunned silence as they learned that the woman they'd trusted with my mental health information was actually a criminal who'd been stealing money from children's charities for over a decade. They heard testimony from other families who'd been destroyed by Patricia's manipulation, and they saw documented evidence of the Morrison family's extensive financial and legal troubles. But the most damaging revelation came when Elizabeth presented evidence that Patricia had specifically targeted me, not because I was actually a threat to anyone, but because she was afraid I would eventually uncover the truth about her. Family's criminal activities. Sloane works in marketing and research, Elizabeth explained to my shocked family. Patricia was terrified that someone with investigative skills would eventually look too closely at her family's background and discover their secrets. So she decided to neutralize the threat by turning Sloane's own family against her. By the time Elizabeth finished her presentation, David Morrison was staring at his mother in horror. Richard looked like he was having a heart attack, and my family appeared to be in complete shock. I think I said quietly into the stunned silence, "We all have some decisions to make about what happens next." The aftermath of that dinner was swift and devastating for the Morrison family, but ultimately healing for mine. Within 48 hours of our confrontation, several things happened that restored my faith in justice and family loyalty. First, my parents and sister spent those 2 days in what Mom later described as the deepest shame spiral of our lives. They realized they had been completely manipulated into betraying their own daughter and sister based on lies, illegal information, and the calculated deception of a master manipulator. The guilt was overwhelming, but more importantly, it was genuine and led to real action. Dad, who had always prided himself on being a good judge of character, was particularly devastated by how thoroughly he'd been fooled. "I let a criminal convince me that my own daughter was the problem," he told me through tears during our first real conversation after the dinner. "I don't know how I'll ever forgive myself for that." Cassidy's reaction was perhaps the most heartbreaking and ultimately the most healing. She immediately filed for an annulment of her marriage to David, explaining that she couldn't remain married to someone whose family had deliberately destroyed her relationship with her sister. "I realized that if David could stand by and watch his mother manipulate my family without saying anything, then he wasn't the man I thought I was marrying," she told me. "You're my sister. You should have been at my wedding, and I should have fought for you instead of believing lies about you." But beyond the personal healing, there were also legal consequences that felt incredibly satisfying after months of feeling powerless. Elizabeth and I had spent weeks preparing a comprehensive case for law enforcement, and within a week of our dinner confrontation, federal agents were at the Morrison family's door with search warrants. The evidence we'd compiled, combined with what they found during their searches, led to multiple federal charges against Patricia Morrison. She was indicted on charges including embezzlement, money laundering, identity theft, violation of privacy laws, conspiracy to commit fraud, and racketeering. The case made national news because of the scope and duration of her criminal enterprise. It turned out that Patricia's network of corrupt contacts and illegal information gathering had been even more extensive than we'd realized. Richard Morrison was also charged in connection with his business dealings, and their entire financial empire collapsed virtually overnight. The family that had been so concerned about maintaining their perfect image found themselves facing decades in prison and complete financial ruin. David, to his credit, cooperated with federal investigators and testified against his parents. He seemed genuinely horrified by what he'd learned about his family, and while I couldn't forgive him for standing silently by while his mother destroyed my family relationships, I could respect his decision to do the right thing. When the truth finally came out, the legal proceedings took over a year, but in the end, Patricia Morrison was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Richard received 12 years. Their assets were seized to pay restitution to the numerous victims of their schemes, including the families they'd socially destroyed and the charities they'd embezzled from. Elizabeth finally got the justice she'd been seeking for 15 years, and more importantly, she got her reputation back. Several of the families that had been manipulated into shunning her reached out to apologize and rebuild their relationships with her. She and my mother were eventually able to rekindle their friendship, bonding over their shared experience of being victimized by Patricia's manipulation. But the most meaningful justice for me was the rebuilding of my family relationships. My parents and sister didn't just apologize, they took concrete action to rebuild the trust they'd broken. They went to family therapy to understand how they'd been manipulated and to develop better communication patterns. They made public statements to their social circle about how they'd been deceived and worked to repair my reputation in their community. Most importantly, Cassidy planned a second wedding ceremony, not to David obviously, but a commitment ceremony to our family bond. It was a small, intimate gathering where she publicly apologized for excluding me from her first wedding and asked me to stand with her as her maid of honor in a ceremony celebrating family loyalty and love over social expectations. The experience taught me some valuable lessons about family loyalty and the difference between blood relations and chosen family. I learned that real family members will fight for you, question accusations against you, and choose you over the approval of strangers. I also learned that sometimes the people who betray you aren't necessarily evil, they're just vulnerable to manipulation by people who are. My relationship with my family is now stronger than it ever was before this ordeal. We've developed better communication patterns, stronger boundaries, and a deeper appreciation for the importance of loyalty and trust. We've also become advocates for other families who've been victimized by social manipulation and reputation destruction. I still work in marketing, but I've also started volunteering with organizations that help families who've been targeted by social predators like Patricia Morrison. Elizabeth and I have become close friends and frequent collaborators in helping other victims seek justice and rebuild their lives. Looking back on everything that happened, I'm actually grateful for the experience, as painful as it was. It showed me who my family really is underneath their fears and social anxieties, and it taught me that sometimes the best way to fight manipulation is with truth, patience, and strategic thinking. The Morrison family learned the hard way that karma has a long memory, and that eventually the truth always comes out. Patricia Morrison's need to destroy other people's lives to protect her own image ultimately led to the complete destruction of everything she'd spent decades building. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced family betrayal or manipulation like this? Have you seen how toxic people can turn family members against each other? What would you have done differently in my situation? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and let me know if you've ever had to seek justice against someone who tried to destroy your family relationships. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life family drama stories with satisfying endings. Share this with anyone who's ever felt betrayed by their family or manipulated by toxic people sometimes. We all need to be reminded that justice is possible, and that the truth really can set us free. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, never let anyone convince you that you're the problem when you're actually the target. Trust your instincts, gather your evidence, and never give up on seeking the truth. Sometimes the best revenge really is living well and seeing justice served.